Smoke curled from pine needles as engineers huddled beneath a steel canopy. The air was thick with fuel, sweat, and the tension of a secret war racing against time. In the final desperate months of World War II, as Allied bombs pounded German cities and Soviet tanks rolled westward, the Nazi high command placed one last bet. Not on a superweapon, but on a machine so fast, so revolutionary, it threatened to rewrite the rules of air combat forever. They called it the Pate 011 engine. And it wasn't built by the Luftwaffe's elite or a genius like Werner von Braun. It was born in a forgotten corner of Germany by a defiant engineer with everything to prove and nothing left to lose. What happened next is a story buried by history, whispered only in declassified memos and shattered test sites. Because when the Allies discovered how close Hitler had come to deploying it, they didn't just seize the blueprints, and they tried to erase the engine forever. Hans Münzel was not a name found in Nazi parades or high command briefings. He didn't wear a uniform. He wore oil-stained coveralls and carried a pencil behind his ear. A quiet, intense man from Leipzig, he had spent his youth obsessed with motion, sketching propellers on napkins, dismantling clocks, watching birds in flight for hours. When war came, he didn't run toward it. He ran into the arms of invention, taking a minor role at Kuhnel Maschinenwerke, a modest engine factory swallowed by the Reich's war machine. There, among rattling presses and sleepless deadlines, he began whispering about a concept no one believed in, an axial flow turbojet, light enough to mount on a single-seater aircraft, powerful enough to outpace sound itself. To most, it was madness. The Messerschmitt 262, the world's first operational jet, was already airborne. Why risk everything on an untested engine from an unranked engineer? But Hans saw what others didn't. The 262's bulky twin Jumo engines were flawed, unreliable, sluggish to throttle, deadly in tight turns. Münzel envisioned something smaller, hotter, and more precise. He didn't want to match the Allies. He wanted to outrun them. But there was a problem. He had no official support. The Reich's bureaucracy favored elite firms, BMW, Heinkel, Junkers. To them, Münzel's ideas were the ravings of a backroom dreamer. He was told to focus on repairs, keep the presses moving, fix broken engines, not imagine new ones. Yet in secret, Hans worked late. He scavenged parts after hours, tested blades in soot-black corners of the factory. By 1943, he had assembled a rough prototype, a snarling, unstable machine that roared like a beast and threatened to melt its own housing. The first test melted the concrete beneath it. The second blew out windows 3 blocks away. But it ran. When he presented the data to a visiting Luftwaffe officer, he was mocked. "This is not a war engine," the officer scoffed. "It is a suicide machine." But Hans wasn't deterred. He didn't want fame. He wanted speed, pure, uncatchable speed. And he believed that in the ruins of Germany, such speed could still change the war's fate, or at the very least, prove he was right. So he buried the rejection, and he built another. By winter of 1944, Münzel's second prototype, codenamed Falk, the Falcon, was ready. Using a modified alloy of chromium and nickel, it could withstand combustion temperatures far beyond what the Allies expected. Its thrust readings dwarfed those of the Jumo 004. It didn't just start, it screamed. But just as Münzel prepared for full testing, his facility was bombed. The Allied campaign against German infrastructure was relentless. His lab was turned to rubble. Colleagues killed, data lost. Only one full engine survived, hidden in a steel crate buried beneath the ruins. Münzel, injured and reeling, could have given up. But he did something no one expected. He loaded the engine onto a truck, covered it with coal, and drove it through war-torn roads, past Gestapo checkpoints, toward the mountains, toward a secret test site where, if he could just make it run one more time, he would change everything. The mountain road to Oberammergau was frozen in silence, its pine-lined passes echoing with distant thunder from collapsing cities. By the time Hans Münzel arrived, the war had nearly consumed Germany. The skies were no longer ruled by the Luftwaffe. American bombers owned the daylight. British raids burned the night. Every village smoldered with rumors of surrender. Yet deep inside an abandoned maintenance hangar, Münzel rolled his battered truck to a stop. Beneath the coal dust and twisted tarps lay his creation, the Falk engine, an outlawed masterpiece built from wreckage and defiance. He had no team, no funding, no orders. Only one surviving assistant, a 19-year-old apprentice named Otto Weber, followed him. Together they stood before the silent hulk of steel and wiring that represented 5 years of obsession. Münzel's hands trembled as he brushed away the soot. "If this works," he whispered, "beat itself will be our witness." The Falk wasn't supposed to exist. Every rule of wartime engineering was against it. The Reich's jet programs were collapsing under shortage and sabotage. Alloy supplies were drying up. Test pilots refused to fly unverified engines. Yet Münzel believed this was the future, not just for Germany, but for aviation itself. His design replaced traditional centrifugal compressors with an axial flow configuration of unparalleled efficiency. It was elegant, almost too modern for its time. Each blade, curved by hand, created a spiral of thrust that pushed the limits of physics and metallurgy alike. But there was more to it than numbers. Münzel's breakthroughs in a single heretical idea. What if temperature was not the enemy, but the ally? While other engineers struggled to cool their turbines, Münzel had devised a heat-hardened alloy that thrived on combustion. He didn't fight the fire, he fed it. That night, as Allied flares painted the distant horizon red, he and Otto prepared for ignition. The hangar walls groaned from old artillery scars. The floor was layered in dust and oil, and every echo seemed to remind them that time was running out. If discovered, their work would be seized, or worse, executed as sabotage. But Münzel no longer feared death. What haunted him was the possibility that his engine, the proof of his life's purpose, might never see the light of day. They bolted the prototype to the floor, wired makeshift fuel lines from a scavenged Messerschmitt tank, and set up the ignition with a cracked switch panel. Otto stood back, eyes wide, as Münzel adjusted the final valve. The engine looked fragile, almost skeletal, a ghost of industry reborn in war's graveyard. Then Münzel gave the order. Ignition. The first seconds were chaos. The starter motor whined, then coughed, then died. A thin hiss of vapor escaped from the intake. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a sound, low, primal, growing. The roar built from a whisper to a scream, until the entire hangar trembled. Dust rained from the rafters. Flames flared blue at the exhaust. Instruments shook off their mounts. Münzel's hair whipped in the blast as Otto shielded his face. The engine didn't just run, it came alive, vibrating with a pulse that felt almost sentient. At full throttle, it reached speeds that stunned even Münzel himself. The readings were clear. Thrust output 35% beyond the Jumo 004. Response time nearly instant. Acceleration curve unthinkable. For the first time in years, Münzel smiled. The impossible was real. But within moments, the dream turned perilous. The test rig began to fracture. The mounting bolts screamed under torque. Hot air poured from ruptured seams, filling the air with metallic heat and the smell of burning oil. Otto shouted over the deafening roar, begging him to cut power. Münzel refused. He needed data, proof that this machine could sustain itself. The dial climbed higher, 8,000 RPM, 9,000. The walls rattled, the glass cracked, the floor began to shift. The roar turned into a howl, sharp as tearing metal. And then, silence. A flash. The lights died. The Falk engine exploded in a storm of fire and shrapnel. When Münzel regained consciousness, the hangar was half collapsed. Otto was alive, bleeding but conscious. The engine lay in pieces, warped but not destroyed. Against all odds, the turbine core, his core, had survived the blast intact. It had reached critical velocity without tearing itself apart. That meant the concept worked. Even in failure, it had proven its genius. But Münzel didn't celebrate. He wept, not from pain, but from the realization that his discovery had come too late. Outside, Germany was already falling. Berlin was surrounded. Command structures were disintegrating. No one would listen to an unknown mechanic from a forgotten plant. In the weeks that followed, Münzel tried to contact surviving officers, but his letters went unanswered. The Reich's remaining scientists were fleeing west, offering themselves to the Americans under Operation Paperclip. He was just one of thousands, a ghost in the wreckage of Hitler's empire. But Münzel refused to abandon his creation. He rebuilt what he could, drafting new blueprints, refining airflow patterns, sketching redesigns in candlelight. Otto begged him to run, but Münzel insisted. If the Allies find this engine, they will understand it. If the Nazis find it, they will destroy it. Either way, it must live beyond us. Then came April 1945. Allied convoys rolled into Bavaria. Tanks cut through forests where his hangar once hid. Münzel buried the core in a drainage pit beneath a fake floor panel, sealing it with concrete. 2 days later, soldiers found him and Otto in the nearby village. They were detained, questioned, and released. The war was over. Germany had lost. And with it, the last traces of Münzel's invention vanished into the fog of occupation. Months later, American engineers stumbled upon the buried core during routine sweeps. They were stunned by what they found, a turbine design far beyond current Allied tech. Documents later revealed that the Falk engine had achieved theoretical speeds close to Mach 0.9, years before the Allies' own turbojets reached that performance. But instead of celebration, the discovery was quietly buried. Records were stamped classified, unverified technology. The reason was simple. The Allies could not allow the world to know how close Nazi Germany had come to mastering jet propulsion supremacy. Münzel never knew. He disappeared into history, his name lost to burned files and unmarked graves. But his design didn't die. It traveled across oceans, folded into research papers, quietly influencing the birth of modern jet aviation. The shape of his compressor blades, the heat-resistant alloys, the airflow geometry, all found echoes in American and Soviet engines within a decade. The man was forgotten. His idea wasn't. And somewhere buried beneath decades of history lies the truth, that an unknown German mechanic, working in secret under fire and ruin, built an engine so advanced, so fast that the victors of the war didn't dare to celebrate it. They tried to erase it. The Allied advance into southern Germany was swift and brutal. By May 1945, Oberammergau was occupied. U.S. Army intelligence, aided by British and French technical divisions, scoured the countryside for any trace of Nazi advanced technology. These weren't casual inspections, they were surgical extractions. Under orders from the newly formed FIAT, Field Information Agency, technical, teams of engineers, scientists, and intelligence officers swept through factories, bunkers, and hidden test sites with a singular mission: find the secrets the Germans had left behind and make sure no one else did. Nuclear research, guided missile systems, and jet propulsion were the crown jewels. Anything else was scrap, but not everything they found could be explained away so easily. At first, the bunker near the burned hangar was overlooked. It was registered as an old maintenance depot, already half collapsed and marked with chalk as cleared. But one British officer, a young RAF intelligence analyst named Colin Mercer, noticed something strange in a set of confiscated Luftwaffe maps. A notation, Werkstatt F, scribbled beside a blank section of forest near Oberammergau. It didn't match any known factory registry. Curious, Mercer ordered a secondary sweep. His team returned days later with something unexpected: a reinforced concrete hatch beneath a collapsed shed. It took hours to dig through the debris. What they uncovered changed the course of post-war aviation and ignited one of the most secretive suppression campaigns of the entire war's aftermath. Buried in the rubble, beneath layers of soot and rusted steel, was the Falk's engine core, still bolted to a cracked steel brace, its turbine intact, its casing scarred from fire and blast pressure. Around it were scorched blueprints, burnt technical notes, and fragments of data reels, many too damaged to read. But the remaining schematics were clear, too clear. The drawings revealed innovations in airflow compression and turbine cooling that the Allies had not yet achieved. Mercer, though only 27, had worked closely with the British jet development teams. He recognized instantly what this meant. Someone in Nazi Germany had solved problems that Rolls-Royce and General Electric were still struggling with, and that someone wasn't in any Allied database. No name, no rank, no formal registration. The Falk engine had seemingly come from nowhere. At first, the discovery was treated with awe. The remains were boxed, documented, and sent under heavy guard to a classified airbase in northwest France, before being flown to Wright Field in Ohio, the heart of America's wartime aerospace intelligence. There, a team of propulsion experts examined every inch of the core. What they found unsettled them. The engine's internal pressure ratios, blade geometry, and thermal resistance all suggested a leap, not an evolution, in design. It wasn't just ahead of its time. It threatened to leapfrog Allied programs by years. Even more disturbing, the materials used in the core included alloys not yet used in Allied engines. Someone had found a way to combine chromium, molybdenum, and nickel in a heat pattern that resisted deformation at full throttle, a key hurdle in supersonic design. In short, this wrecked, war-borne engine had hints of Mach-level potential. This discovery presented the Allied command with a grim dilemma. If word spread that a rogue German engineer, unknown, unsanctioned, and uncelebrated, had come within inches of creating the most advanced engine of the era, it would raise uncomfortable questions. How many more breakthroughs had they missed? How fragile had their own air superiority really been? Worse, the Soviet Union was now deep in eastern Germany, conducting its own raids on Nazi science. If they got wind of this engine's existence, the Cold War might begin not with bombs, but with turbines. So the order came down from Washington and London alike. Bury it. The Falk engine was labeled Anomalous Propulsion Specimen, Type X4, and removed from official inventory. The blueprints were quietly absorbed into broader research programs, often redrawn and relabeled. Colin Mercer was reassigned, sworn to secrecy. Even the few German scientists who had worked near Kühnel Maschinenwerk were told nothing, or in some cases quietly silenced through denazification proceedings that never saw a courtroom. The files were locked under what would later become known as Project Lusty, an operation designed to harvest Nazi aeronautical technology while carefully controlling its narrative. Within a year, the Falk was forgotten, not lost, but hidden in plain sight, dissected into anonymous innovations, scattered across the upcoming jet generations. Its turbine pattern appeared in the General Electric J-47, used in the Korean War. Its combustion strategy echoed in the Rolls-Royce Avon. Soviet engines from Mikoyan-Gurevich even mirrored its blade geometry, suggesting someone somewhere had leaked the findings eastward. But the man who made it never saw this. Hans Münzel, after being released from Allied custody, vanished. Some say he died of malnutrition in a bombed-out village. Others claim he escaped into Austria under false papers. A few unconfirmed accounts place him in Argentina by 1947, where Nazi fugitives often fled. What's certain is this: he never worked on another engine again. His name does not appear in patent registries, aerospace journals, or post-war design boards. In the official story of jet propulsion, he does not exist. And that is perhaps the most haunting part of the story. In a war that devoured millions of lives, one man's brilliance was deemed too dangerous, too inconvenient, to remember. He wasn't a Nazi ideologue. He wasn't a weapon builder. He was a mechanic, a mind forged in soot and steel, who solved a puzzle that others deemed impossible. But because his timing was wrong and his allegiance on the losing side, he became a ghost in history. Meanwhile, the engine he built, the Falk, lived on, not as a legend, but as a silent foundation beneath the jets that would rule the skies for the next 50 years. Every time a fighter screamed through the clouds at supersonic speed, it carried the DNA of Münzel's forgotten genius. By 1947, the world was no longer divided by trenches. It was divided by silence. The war was over, but its secrets were just beginning to surface. As the ashes of Europe cooled and new empires rose from the ruins, the skies became the new battlefield. Jet propulsion was the crown jewel of national pride and military deterrence. Nations scrambled not only to build the fastest aircraft, but to own the story of how it was done. America, now a superpower in aviation, unveiled its new fighters with confidence. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the North American F-86 Sabre, each hailed as a testament to Allied ingenuity. But inside their engines, deep in the spinning hearts of these war machines, were traces of a ghost. In laboratories across Ohio, California, and Derby, Britain, pieces of the Falk engine, the X4 anomaly, were being quietly studied, replicated, and never named. Engineers called them inspired concepts, forward-leaning Nazi designs, or more commonly, unattributable assets. No one dared put Hans Münzel's name on paper. His innovations were too controversial, too politically risky. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, Soviet aviation was undergoing its own metamorphosis. Following a similar sweep through eastern Germany, Soviet agents had recovered fragments of destroyed test sites, some believed to be associated with Münzel's original prototype. Whether through espionage, captured scientists, or sheer deduction, Soviet engineers began developing what would become the MiG-15. It was a direct rival to the American Sabre, capable of blistering speed, brutal climb rates, and deadly agility. While the West believed its secrets were safe, the core designs of the Falk engine had already leaped borders. Blade profiles, heat flow modeling, shock-resilient turbine housing. The influence was undeniable, yet buried beneath false authorship and misfiled patents. Münzel's fingerprints were on both sides of the Cold War, without a single word of credit. Back in Europe, those few who had known him, the machinists, the test assistants, even Otto Weber, were scattered, silenced, or dead. Otto himself, the teenage apprentice who had survived the Falk's final test, immigrated to Canada in 1950 under a false name. He never spoke publicly of what he'd seen. In a letter found decades later by his grandson, Otto wrote, Hans used to say the engine wasn't meant for war. It was meant for what comes after war. He dreamed of planes without guns, just speed and sky. That dream, too, was stolen. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was existential. In the New World Order, innovation became a weapon of ideology. For the West, the narrative was clear. The Allies had won because they were smarter, freer, more democratic. Admitting that a nameless German, one unaffiliated with the Nazi elite, had quietly built the most advanced turbojet core of the era shattered that narrative. To the victors, history was not only written by the winners, but designed by them too. So Münzel's legacy was scattered into 1,000 parts, never whole again. His patents, had they been filed, would have rewritten the aviation industry. His methods would have shaped universities. His diagrams, preserved in corners of secret laboratories, continued to teach engineers lessons in airflow efficiency and combustion modeling well into the 1960s, but never in textbooks, never in classrooms. Instead, those insights were handed off as breakthroughs of Western minds, test pilots and engineers who had never seen the inside of a freezing Bavarian hangar, never smelled the burning oil, or heard the scream of an unchained turbine in the night. They inherited a crown built by someone they didn't know existed. This silence wasn't the result of malice alone, it was fear. The Allies feared what it meant if Münzel had succeeded, that brilliance can rise in the most brutal regimes, that science doesn't care who is right or wrong, that truth sometimes is born on the wrong side of the war. How could they explain to a world still grieving that their next generation of fighter jets was flying on technology crafted in secret by a man who had no rank, no honors, no place in official history? They couldn't, so they locked it away. Meanwhile, new generations of jets began to dominate the skies. The F-104 Starfighter, English Electric Lightning, Sukhoi Su-9, all bore echoes of Münzel's core designs, especially in engine compartment layout and heat diffusion strategies. It became impossible to deny. The ghost of the Falk was everywhere. Whispers of its origins circulated among high-level aerospace researchers, but no one dared say the name. In internal memos, it was the Oberammergau core, or Type F anomaly. The truth was too disruptive, too heavy, and so Hans Münzel became something worse than forgotten. He became erased. His grave is unknown. His family, if any remained, never reclaimed his work. And the engine that could have made him one of the most significant minds in aviation was silenced, not because it failed, but because it worked too well. Today, a few fragments of the original Falk engine survive in locked storage at a secure site in the United States. The casing is scarred, warped, and nameless. A few pages of its original schematics, partially burned, sit in a military archive, cataloged under misaligned dates. Visitors to these archives will find no mention of Münzel, no birth records, no death certificate, as if history itself had conspired to protect the myth of victory at the cost of a man's truth. Yet the jets still fly, and each time they do, they carry a secret. They were shaped by a mechanic no one was supposed to remember. It's one of history's cruelest ironies, that the most extraordinary minds are often born not into fame but into fire. Hans Münzel never asked for recognition. He never fought for medals, nor did he seek the favor of generals or the spotlight of glory. He wanted only one thing: to outrun the limits that others accepted as fixed, to tear through the invisible walls of speed and silence, and leave behind not a legacy of destruction, but of possibility. Yet in the chaos of collapsing empires, the world had no time for dreamers, and so his name vanished, but not his vision, because what Hans built could not be buried. It had momentum, it had lift, and long after the world forgot the man, it continued to chase the trail of his fire. In the Cold War that followed, the superpowers raced toward the edge of the sky, locked in a contest of speed, altitude, and dominance. They built machines to break the sound barrier, then the edge of space. Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3. And every time an engineer tested a new compressor configuration or examined thermal expansion curves in high-altitude thrust chambers, they were unknowingly walking the path that Münzel had paved, alone in silence, surrounded by ruins. The Falcon engine, though renamed, rebranded, and deconstructed, was now everywhere. In B-47 bombers soaring over Eastern Europe, in MiG fighters intercepting spy planes, in prototypes that never left the drawing board but taught the world new rules about what was possible. And yet, even as his brilliance echoed across generations, Münzel himself remained a shadow. There was no statue, no museum exhibit, no biography. What remained were only the fragments, unattributed designs in classified reports, burn marks on test cell walls, and the occasional astonished note scribbled in the margin of a long-forgotten engineering audit. This heat resistance, how did they do it? Only in those quiet questions does his ghost stir. Only there does the story threaten to resurface like a whisper in the jet stream, reminding us that history is not always made by the visible, but often by the invisible, those whose hands forge the future in the dark. But perhaps what haunts us most is not the injustice of Münzel's erasure. It is the deeper truth it reveals. That genius, when it is inconvenient, is often hidden, not because it failed, but because it succeeded in ways the world was not ready to accept. Hans Münzel didn't fit the story the victors wanted to tell. He was German but not Nazi, a mechanic, not a general, a creator, not a killer. His invention came not with propaganda or parades, but with doubt, isolation, and relentless obsession. In a world on fire, he dared to imagine something faster than destruction itself. And for that, history looked away. Yet there is something profoundly human in Münzel's journey. He reminds us that even in the most brutal chapters of time, there are those who build, not to destroy, but to defy, who keep working when no one is watching, who believe when no one believes in them. His engine roared not because he sought power, but because he could not bear to let limits go unchallenged. And though he died unrecognized, every jet that leapt higher, burned faster, and flew farther carried a piece of his soul. We live in an age where names are currency, where legacies are curated, where visibility is mistaken for worth. But Hans Münzel teaches us the opposite. That courage is not always public. That greatness does not require witnesses. That truth, even when buried, finds its way into the sky. His story is not just about an engine. It's about what happens when genius is ignored, when the world turns its back on those who refuse to accept the boundaries of the possible. It's about the power of one person, armed with nothing but knowledge and will, to build something the world wasn't ready for, and to change everything because of it. And so, next time you hear the thunder of a jet tearing across the heavens, remember, someone, somewhere in the ruins of war and the silence of exile, once imagined that sound. They shaped it with bare hands and sleepless nights. And though history tried to forget him, the sky never did. Because up there, speed tells the truth. And truth, like Münzel's engine, can never be erased. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, Soviet aviation was undergoing its own metamorphosis. Following a similar sweep through Eastern Germany, Soviet agents had recovered fragments of destroyed test sites, some believed to be associated with Münzel's original prototype.